They often say an avoidant runs away from love, but that might be too simple. A deeper truth is that they may not be running from another person at all. They could be running from what they see in themselves when someone like that person is close to them. It is the reflection that becomes too intense to stay with. When a super empath enters their life, it is not just attraction on the surface. It is something deeper being activated. The avoidant begins to feel parts of themselves that were buried long ago. This is not just rejection or avoidance in the usual sense. It feels more like an inner conflict, almost like a quiet psychological struggle. What looks like obsession is not really about love in the romantic sense, but more like the mind and soul reacting to something that demands change and awareness. Avoidant people are often labeled as cold or emotionally distant, but most of the time this distance is not cruelty, size. It is protection. Emotional closeness once felt unsafe to them, so they learned to step away from it before it could hurt them. Over time, emotions became something to manage from a distance rather than something to fully enter. Inside them, there is usually a part that once wanted love freely and openly, but after experiences of rejection, neglect, or emotional pain, that part was pushed down and hidden. That hidden emotional self does not disappear. It stays alive beneath the surface. So when they meet a super empath, something unusual happens. The empath does not just show kindness or interest. They naturally express emotional awareness, depth, sensitivity, and honesty in feeling. They can connect without controlling and love without manipulation. These traits do not just feel attractive to the avoidant. They feel familiar in a strange way, like something they once had or once needed but lost. The empath becomes a mirror. Not a surface-level mirror, but one that reflects something the avoidant can no longer easily access in themselves. That reflection creates both comfort and fear at the same time. Comfort because it feels like home in a forgotten way. Fear because going toward it means facing everything they avoided for years. So a push and pull begins. The avoidant feels drawn in, not fully understanding why, and at the same time feels a strong need to pull away. The closer the empath gets emotionally, the more exposed the avoidant feels. And exposure is what they were trained to avoid. This is why they may shut down, withdraw, disappear, or act distant, even while still thinking about the person afterward. In the mind of the empath, the avoidant may feel seen in a deep and real way, not just as a role or behavior, but as a whole person with hidden layers. That kind of presence can wake up emotional parts of the avoidant that have been silent for a long time. It creates longing, but also discomfort, because longing itself was something they learned to suppress. Even when distance is created, the emotional imprint does not fully leave. The empath remains in their thoughts, memories, and even dreams at times, not because of attachment alone, but because the interaction touched something unconscious, something unresolved, something unfinished inside them. This is where obsession can begin to form. But it is important to understand it clearly. It is not simply obsession with the person. It is obsession with what the person activated inside them. The empath becomes a symbol of a lost emotional version of the self, a version that once existed before fear took over. From a psychological point of view, this connects to the idea of the shadow. The shadow is everything a person pushes away from themselves, like emotional need, vulnerability, fear of abandonment, or desire for closeness. The avoidant often rejects these parts because they feel unsafe or overwhelming. But the super empath, by simply being who they are, brings those same qualities back into awareness without forcing anything. This creates internal tension. The avoidant may feel restless, confused, or emotionally unstable at times, even if nothing external is happening. They may not understand why the person keeps coming to mind. The reason is that something within them has been stirred and is asking to be recognized. The empath becomes both a trigger and a kind of emotional medicine, not because they are trying to fix anything, but because their presence highlights what has been disconnected inside the avoidant. And once that inner material is activated, it does not easily go quiet again. This connection often feels like opposites being pulled together. One side avoids emotional depth to stay safe, while the other naturally lives inside emotional depth. One protects through distance, The other connects through openness. This is not just personality difference, it is a deeper psychological contrast playing out between two inner worlds. The avoidant can feel both drawn and threatened at the same time. Drawn to the emotional safety and understanding they sense in the empath, but threatened by what closeness demands from them. At the same time, the empath may intuitively sense the emotional depth behind the avoidant's distance, even if it is hidden. This creates a strong psychological pull, not always healthy or stable, but very powerful, because what is being activated is not just attraction between two people, but the deeper desire for emotional wholeness, a need to bring together what has been split inside. The obsession continues because the mind keeps returning to what it cannot fully resolve. The avoidant is not just thinking about a person. They are confronting an inner division they have carried for a long time. And once that division is touched, it is no longer easy to return to emotional numbness the same way as before. In the end, this connection becomes less about relationship on the surface and more about inner transformation. The empath represents emotional openness, while the avoidant represents emotional protection. When these two meet, something inside both is forced into awareness. And even if distance happens, the impact remains, because what was awakened was not just feeling for another person, but a forgotten part of the self trying to be seen again. They often describe the avoidant as someone who runs from love, but their inner world is usually more complex than that. It is built on distance, control, and quiet emotional rules that exist to prevent vulnerability from turning into chaos. For them, emotional closeness is not just uncomfortable, it feels risky, like something that could destabilize the structure they rely on to stay grounded. So when a super empath enters their life, someone who can sense emotional undercurrents without needing explanations, something in the avoidant begins to shift. It does not happen in a clean or conscious way. Instead, they start testing the connection. These tests are not calculated harm or manipulation in the deliberate sense. They are reactions shaped by fear and uncertainty, almost like unconscious experiments to see if safety is real or just another illusion. They may withdraw suddenly, become cold, stop responding, or act emotionally detached. Then they watch closely, not to hurt the other person, but to observe what happens next. Deep down, they are trying to confirm a pattern they already expect, that closeness eventually leads to rejection, punishment, or abandonment. This expectation is built from earlier emotional experiences where vulnerability did not feel safe. But the empath often responds in a very different way. Instead of reacting with anger, panic, or withdrawal, they remain steady, they stay present. They do not chase aggressively or collapse emotionally. They simply hold emotional space with patience and calm understanding. And this is where the avoidant becomes unsettled, because what they expected does not happen. Where they anticipated distance in return, there is still presence. Where they expected emotional punishment, there is acceptance. This breaks their internal prediction system. It creates confusion, curiosity, and a growing sense of fascination they cannot easily explain. The more they push away, the more they notice the empath does not fall apart. The silence does not scare them off immediately. The emotional distance does not destroy the connection. Instead, the empath remains emotionally grounded. And for someone who is used to others reacting strongly to their withdrawal, this becomes deeply unfamiliar. Slowly, the empath starts to feel less like a normal person in their experience and more like an emotional constant. Someone who does not respond in predictable ways. Someone who does not punish emotional complexity. This creates a kind of psychological fixation, not purely romantic, but observational and internal. The avoidant begins to think about them more, question them more, and monitor the connection even while trying to stay distant. What is really happening is not simple attraction. It is the mind trying to understand something it cannot categorize. The empath becomes a symbol of emotional stability without control, closeness without collapse, and connection without fear. And for the avoidant, this is not familiar territory. This is also where the deeper psychological tension appears. The avoidant does not just fear losing others. They fear losing themselves inside closeness. Intimacy feels like exposure. So when someone remains steady in the face of their emotional withdrawal, it disrupts their entire survival strategy. Even after distance is created or the connection changes form, the empath does not fully disappear from their inner world. Instead, they remain present in memory and thought, not as a simple attachment, but as a reference point. The mind returns to them during quiet moments, not necessarily out of longing, but out of unresolved emotional processing. Over time, the avoidant may begin to compare future connections to this experience, not because everything else is bad, but because something about that emotional dynamic felt different. Something felt deeper, more real, or more psychologically revealing. What they miss is not just the person, but the emotional state they experienced around them. That state is hard to recreate. It is the feeling of being seen without being judged, of being emotionally met without pressure, and of not having to perform a version of themselves to be accepted. That experience leaves an imprint, even if the relationship itself does not continue. This is where obsession can appear, but it is important to understand it correctly. It is not simply attachment to a person. It is the mind looping around an emotional experience that changed how they perceive themselves. The empath becomes a kind of internal reference point for emotional awareness, even after they are gone. The avoidant may try to move on externally, engage in new interactions, or distract themselves, but internally, something has already shifted. Their usual emotional strategies do not feel as complete anymore. Detachment no longer feels fully satisfying, and control no longer feels fully secure. Because once someone has experienced emotional presence without pressure, it creates a contrast that is hard to ignore. Not because it was perfect, but because it revealed something missing. The empath, without trying to force change, ends up reflecting back the avoidant's own suppressed emotional world. That reflection is what makes the experience so intense. It is not just about connection with another person. It is about encountering parts of the self that were long kept out of awareness. And once that happens, the mind does not simply erase it. It continues to revisit it, process it, and try to make sense of it. So the obsession is not really about possession or romance in a simple sense. It is the psyche responding to an internal shift it cannot ignore. It is the pull toward integration, even if the person experiencing it does not consciously understand that is what is happening. The empath becomes a symbol of something deeper: emotional truth, openness, and the possibility of connection without fear. And the avoidant, even in distance, cannot fully unsee that possibility once it has been experienced. In the end, what lingers is not just memory of a person, but the imprint of an emotional reality they briefly touched. And that imprint becomes a quiet force in the background of their inner world, continuing to shape how they understand connection, safety, and themselves. In the end, the avoidance fixation on the super empath is not really about the person themselves, but about what that person awakens within them. The empath acts like a mirror, reflecting the avoidant's buried emotions, unmet needs, and forgotten capacity for closeness. This creates confusion, attraction, and resistance all at once, because what feels like connection is actually inner confrontation. What remains after distance is not simple longing, but an emotional imprint that keeps resurfacing in thought and memory. The avoidant cannot easily return to their old way of detaching, because something in them has already been touched and activated. So the real conclusion is this: the obsession is not external, it is internal. It is the mind and soul pushing the avoidant toward awareness, integration, and the possibility of becoming whole again through the very emotions they once tried to escape.